The bells of St. Agatha's Priory rang with their familiar weight, each bronze note settling into my bones like a prayer I could no longer speak. I knelt upon the cold stone of the chapel floor, my knees already numb from the morning's devotion, yet I dared not move. The other sisters had long since departed for their daily labor, leaving me alone with my torment and the flickering candles that cast dancing shadows upon the ancient walls. My name is Sister Catherine, though that name feels foreign upon my tongue even now. 3 years after I spoke my final vows, before these walls claimed me, I was Lady Catherine de Montmorency, daughter of a nobleman whose lands stretched across the green valleys of Yorkshire. But that life died with my father's sword and my mother's tears, buried beneath the weight of war and the cruel hand of fate that left our house in. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of blue and gold across the worn stones where countless women had knelt before me. I pressed my palms together until my knuckles turned white, willing my troubled heart to find the peace that had eluded me these many months. Yet peace, it seemed, was not meant for one such as I. Sister Catherine, the voice came from behind me, gentle yet commanding. I did not need to turn to know it belonged to Father Benedict, though every fiber of my being urged me to face him. His footsteps echoed in the sacred space as he approached, each sound a reminder of the burden I carried within my chest. "Father," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the ancient. "I thought you had departed for the village this morning." "The sick child recovered in the night," he replied, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had both comforted and tormented these past months. God's mercy prevailed. As always, I closed my eyes tightly, feeling the familiar ache that his presence brought. Father Benedict had arrived at our priory 6 months prior, sent by the bishop to serve as our confessor and spiritual guide. He was young for such a position, perhaps 30 years to my 22, with dark hair that caught the light like burnished copper and eyes, the color of forest shadows. But it was not his appearance that troubled me. It was the kindness in his voice when he spoke of God's love, the gentle way he guided lost souls back to the light, including my own lost. "Sister Catherine," he said again, and I heard him settle onto the wooden prie-dieu behind me. "You have been here since Lauds. The abbess grows concerned for your welfare." How could I tell him that I knelt here, not in devotion, but in desperate hope that the stones might swallow me whole, that every prayer I spoke felt like ash upon my tongue, because my heart harbored thoughts that would damn me to hellfire? "I find solace in prayer." "Father," I lied, the words bitter as wormwood. "Yet solace should bring peace, not the shadow I see upon your countenance." I turned then, unable to resist the pull of his voice, and found him watching me with those dark eyes that seemed to see into the very depths of my soul. He wore the simple brown robes of his order, yet somehow he made them seem noble. His hands rested upon his knees, strong hands that I had watched break bread and bless the sick, hands that I had dreamed of in moments of weakness. "Forgive me, Father," I whispered, looking away quickly. "I fear my thoughts are ... disorder." The silence stretched between us like a taut string, ready to snap at the slightest. I heard him shift upon his, heard the rustle of his robes, and felt the weight of his gaze upon me. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "it would benefit your soul to speak of these disorders in the sanctity of confession." My heart stopped, then began again with such violence I was certain he must hear it. Confession? The very word sent tremors through my frame. How many times had I knelt in that small wooden booth, listening to his voice through the latticed screen, feeling his presence so close I could hear his. How many times had I confessed smaller sins while the greater one burned within me like a brand? I am not certain. I am ready, Father. We are never ready for God's mercy, child. It comes to us in our unworthiness, not our preparation. The wisdom in his words should have comforted me. Instead, it only deepened my anguish, for I knew that what I carried in my heart was beyond mercy, beyond forgiveness. Yet what choice did I have? The weight of my secret grew heavier each day, threatening to crush the very breath from my lungs. "Very well," I whispered, rising on unsteady legs. "If you believe it would serve my soul." The confessional stood in the northern transept of the chapel, a simple wooden structure that had heard the sins of countless souls across the centuries. As I approached it, my hands trembling like autumn leaves, I wondered how many others had entered with secrets that burned like mine, how many had spoken desires that defied the very foundations of their faith. I settled into the narrow space, the familiar scent of old wood and incense enveloping me like a shroud. Through the lattice screen, I could see the shadow of Father Benedict as he took his place. We were so close that if not for that wooden barrier, I could have reached out and touched him. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," I began, the ritual words falling from my lips like stones into still water. "It has been 3 days since my last confession. Speak, child, what burdens your heart?" For a long moment, I could not find my voice. The words that I had rehearsed in the dark hours before dawn now seemed impossible. Yet I knew that if I did not unburden myself now, the weight of my secret would destroy me utterly. "Father," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I fear I have committed the gravest of sins within my heart." "What sin troubles you so?" I pressed my hands to my face, feeling the tears that had threatened all morning finally spilled down my cheek. I have harbored feelings that are forbidden to one of my station, desires that mock the very vows I have. The silence from beyond the screen stretched so long that I began to fear he had departed, leaving me alone with my shame. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, as if the words cost him great effort. "What manner of desires, Sister Catherine?" The sound of my name upon his lips, spoken with such gentleness, despite the gravity of my confession, nearly undid me completely. I gripped the wooden rail before me, my knuckles white with the effort of remaining upright. I swallowed hard, tasting salt from my tears. I have imagined what it might be to know tenderness, to feel the warmth of love that is not divine but earthly, to be cherished not as a bride of Christ but as a woman. My words hung in the air between us like incense, heavy and intoxicating. I waited for his response, for the gentle rebuke that would remind me of my place, my vows, my duty to God above all earthly considerations. Instead, I heard him draw a shaking breath. "Sister Catherine," he said, and his voice was different now, rougher somehow, as if my words had affected him in ways I had not dared hope. "Such thoughts, they are not uncommon. The flesh is weak, and we are all tested. But these thoughts," I pressed on, knowing I must speak all or forever hold my peace, "they are not of some distant, unknown love. They center upon one I should regard only with the respect due to his holy office." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ear. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. The single word fell between us like a confession. I closed my eyes, knowing that once I spoke the truth, there could be no retreat from this precipice upon which we stood. "You, Father," I breathed, "in my weakness, in my sin, it is you who haunts my prayers and troubles my dreams. You, who I long to know, not as my confessor, but as a man." The words left me in a rush, and with them went the last of my strength. I slumped forward, my forehead pressed against the wooden screen that separated us, my breath coming in short gasps, as if I had run a great distance. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I heard the sound of wood creaking, the rustle of robes, and suddenly, the door to his side of the confessional opened. I looked up through my tears, to see him standing there, his face pale as winter moonlight, his dark eyes wide with what I could only describe as anguish. "Catherine," he said, and my name fell from his lips like a prayer or a curse. "Sweet mercy, what have we done?" Before I could answer, before I could think or breathe or flee, he stepped into my side of the confessional. The space was so narrow that we were pressed close together, closer than we had ever been. I could smell the soap he used to wash his hair, could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights spent in prayer and study. "Father, I do not call me Father," he said roughly, his hands coming up to frame my face. "Not now, not when you look at me thus." "Benedict," I whispered, and the sound of his Christian name seemed to break something within him. "God forgive me," he breathed, and then his lips were upon mine. The kiss was everything I had dreamed and feared it would be. Gentle at first, tentative, as if he could not quite believe what he was doing. Then deeper, more desperate, as if he were a drowning man and I his salvation. His hands tangled in my hair, disturbing the neat coif that marked me as a bride of Christ, and I cared not at all. I had been kissed before, in the life that existed before these walls claimed me. Lord Edmund de Clare had pressed his lips to mine the night before he rode to a gentle farewell that I thought would sustain me through whatever trials lay ahead. But this was fire and storm, and the very breaking of the world. When we finally broke apart, we were both trembling. His forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my lips, and for a moment we simply stood there in the aftermath of our transgression. "We cannot," he whispered, though his hand still held my face, as if he could not bear to let me go. "This is madness. We have both sworn sacred vows." "I know," I replied, my voice breaking. "I know what we have done. I know what it makes us." He pulled away then, stumbling backwards until his shoulders hit the wall of the confessional. His face was a mask of torment, and I saw my own anguish reflected in his eyes. "I should not have, sweet Virgin Mary. What manner of priest am I to take advantage of your vulnerability thus?" "You took advantage of nothing," I said firmly, though my voice shook. "I spoke my desire, and you answered. The sin is mine as much as yours." "The sin," he repeated hollowly. "Yes, we have sinned grievously this day." The weight of those words settled upon us like a funeral shroud. We stood there in the narrow space, breathing hard, neither of us able to move or speak. The morning light still streamed through the stained glass, still painted its patterns of blue and gold upon the stones, but the world had changed irrevocably in the space of that kiss. Finally, Father Benedict, for I knew I must think of him thus. Whatever my heart might wish, straightened his robes and stepped away from me. His face had regained some of its composure, though I could see the storm that still raged behind his eyes. "Sister Catherine," he said formally, "we must speak of this transgression no more. What has passed between us? ... It was a moment of weakness, nothing. You must return to your duties, and I to mine. We shall pray for God's forgiveness and strive never again to fall into such temptation." I nodded, though the gesture felt like a lie. How could I pretend that nothing had changed when my very soul felt transformed? How could I return to the simple routine of prayer and work when I now knew the taste of his kiss? "Yes, Father," I managed to say. "As you wish." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the same struggle in his eyes that I felt within my own heart. Then he stepped out of the confessional and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the chapel until they faded entirely. I remained where I was, sinking to my knees upon the cold stone floor. The morning was advancing, and soon the other sisters would return for the midday prayers. I needed to compose myself, to hide all trace of what had transpired, but for now, I allowed myself this moment to remember the warmth of his hands upon my face, the desperate tenderness of his kiss, and to wonder what God would make of such a love as ours. The days that followed passed in a haze of desperate normalcy. I attended prayers with my sister, worked in the scriptorium copying illuminated manuscripts, tended the herb garden behind the kitchen. To any observer, I was the same Sister Catherine who had taken her vows 3 years prior, dutiful, devout, dedicated to her calling. Yet beneath this facade, I was drowning. Every glimpse of Father Benedict across the chapel set my heart racing. When he celebrated Mass, I found myself watching his hands as they blessed the communion bread, remembering how those same hands had held my face with such tender desperation. When he spoke of God's love from the pulpit, I heard echoes of his whispered words in the confessional. When he passed me in the corridors of the priory, the brief brush of his robes against mine sent shivers through my entire being. If he was suffering as I suffered, he showed no outward sign of it. His sermons remained eloquent and passionate, his guidance to the other sisters wise and gentle. Only occasionally did I catch him watching with an expression I could not quite read, a shadow of something that might have been longing or regret. Sister Margaret, who worked beside me in the scriptorium, began to comment upon my distracted state. "Thy hand trembles so that the ink blots upon the parchment," she observed one afternoon as we worked on a psalter for the bishop's chapel. "Art thou unwell, Sister Catherine?" "Merely tired," I replied, setting down my quill before I could do more damage to the delicate illumination. "I have not been sleeping well of late. Mayhap thou shouldst speak with Mother Abbess. She could prepare thee a draught of chamomile and valerian." The last thing I desired was to draw the abbess's attention to my condition. Mother Scholastica was a woman of great wisdom and discernment. I feared that one look into my eyes would reveal all my secrets. "I shall consider it," I said, though I had no intention of doing so. As the afternoon wore on, I found it impossible to concentrate upon my work. The elegant Latin verses that should have flowed from my pen seemed to mock me with their praise of divine love and sacred devotion. How could I illuminate passages about the purity of the soul when my own soul was so thoroughly corrupted? Finally, unable to bear the weight of my thoughts any longer, I excused myself from the scriptorium and sought refuge in the chapel. The space was empty at this hour, the other sisters engaged in their various duties. I made my way to the altar and knelt before the great crucifix that dominated the eastern wall. "Forgive me," I whispered to the carved figure of Christ, though I was not certain what forgiveness I sought. Forgiveness for the kiss, for the desire that still burned within me, or for the fact that, despite my shame, I could not bring myself to regret what had passed between Father Benedict and myself. I had been praying or attempting to pray for perhaps a quarter of an hour when I heard footsteps behind me. Every nerve in my body came alive as I recognized the familiar cadence of Father Benedict's. He approached slowly, as if reluctant to disturb my devotion, and settled onto the wooden prie-dieu several feet to my left. For long minutes, we knelt in silence, two souls supposedly united in prayer, but actually drowning in the weight of unspoken words. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor between us. I was acutely aware of his presence, of the soft sound of his breathing, of the way he occasionally shifted upon his knees. "Sister Catherine," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I fear I have done thee a great disservice." I turned to look at him, drinking in the sight of his profile as he stared up at the crucifix. There were new lines around his eyes, and I wondered if he too had been sleeping poorly. "No greater disservice than I have done myself," I replied. "We are both guilty in this matter." "Nay," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I am thy spiritual guide, thy confessor. I should have been stronger, should have offered thee proper counsel, rather than ... double quotes, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to speak of what had transpired between us. "Rather than showing me the same human weakness that I showed thee." He closed his eyes as if my words pained him. "I am a priest, Catherine. I have sworn before God to remain celibate, to devote my life entirely to his service. What I did, what we did, it was a betrayal of everything I have pledged myself to uphold. And I am a nun, bound by the same vows of chastity. Yet here we sit, both of us struggling with feelings that our stations forbid." I drew a shaking breath. "Tell me, Father, do you regret it? Do you wish with all your heart that moment had never come to pass?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken. When he finally looked at me, his eyes held such anguish that I felt my heart break for him. "I should," he said quietly. "God knows I should regret it with every fiber of my being. But he stopped, shaking his head. "This is madness. We cannot speak of such things." "Then what are we to do?" I asked, desperate. "How are we to continue serving in the same house, seeing each other daily, knowing what lies between? How do I sit through your sermons, knowing the taste of your? How do I confess my sins to you when the greatest sin is the very desire I feel when I look upon you?" "I know not," he admitted, and there was such defeat in his voice that I felt tears prick at my eyes. Perhaps it would be best if I requested reassignment. The bishop could send another priest to serve as your confessor." The thought of him leaving struck me like a physical blow. I had known it might come to this, had feared it even as I confessed my fear. But hearing him speak the words aloud made them real, in a way I was not prepared for. "Is that what you wish?" I asked, though I dreaded his answer. "What I wish and what I must do are two very different," he replied. "My duty is clear, even if my heart rebels against it." Before I could respond, the sound of sandaled feet upon stone announced the approach of another sister. We both turned to see Sister Agatha entering the chapel, her aged frame bent with the weight of her many years. She moved slowly toward the altar, her devotion to the evening prayers unwavering despite her failing health. Father Benedict rose quickly, composing his features into the mask of priestly dignity he wore so well. "I must prepare for vespers," he said formally. "Good day, Sister Catherine." "Good day, Father," I replied, matching his formal tone despite the turmoil in my heart. He left without another word, his robes rustling as he strode toward the sacristy. I remained kneeling, watching Sister Agatha as she settled herself before the altar with the slow, careful movements of advanced age. Her lips moved silently in prayer, her gnarled hands working the beads of her rosary with practice. Here was a woman who had found true peace in her calling, who had never been troubled by the earthly desires that tormented. I envied her that certainty, that pure devotion untainted by the weakness of the flesh. As I finally rose to leave the chapel, I wondered if I would ever find such peace myself, or if I was doomed to carry this burden for the rest of my days. That evening, as we gathered for compline, I noticed that Father Benedict avoided my eyes entirely. He spoke the prayers with his usual reverence, led us in the sacred songs with his clear, strong voice, but he did not once look in my direction. It was as if I had become invisible to him, a ghost haunting the edges of his vision. The realization that he was deliberately shutting me out hurt more than I had expected. I told myself it was for the best, that distance between us was the only path to redemption. But my heart felt as if it were being slowly crushed in a vice. After the final prayers, as the sisters filed out of the chapel in their customary silence, I lingered behind, hoping for one last word with him. But he busied himself with extinguishing candles and arranging the altar cloths, clearly waiting for me to depart. Message received, I thought bitterly, and made my way to my cell with leaden feet. The weeks that followed were an exercise in exquisite torture. Father Benedict maintained his professional distance, speaking to me only when his duties required it, avoiding any situation where we might find ourselves alone. During Mass, he kept his eyes fixed upon his prayer book or the altar, never allowing his gaze to wander to where I knelt among my sisters. In the corridors, he acknowledged my presence with the briefest of nods before quickly moving on. I should have been grateful for his restraint. Instead, I found myself growing desperate for even the smallest sign that I still existed in his world. A glance, a word, anything to indicate that the kiss we had shared meant something to him beyond a moment of regrettable weakness. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Father Benedict was determined to treat our transgression as if it had never occurred. Perhaps, for him, that was the only way to continue functioning in his role. For me, the constant pretense was slowly driving me to distraction. My work in the scriptorium suffered as my concentration wavered. I found myself staring out the window at the garden where I had sometimes seen him walking in contemplation, imagining what it might be like to join him there, to speak freely of the thoughts and feelings that consumed me. The other sisters began to notice my distraction, and I feared it would not be long before Mother Abbess summoned me for a private conference. It was Sister Margaret who finally forced the approaching me one afternoon as I struggled with a particularly delicate piece of illumination. "Sister Catherine," she said, her voice kind but concerned, "forgive me, but I cannot ignore thy evident distress any longer. For weeks now, thou hast been pale and distracted, thy work suffering, thy appetite failing. What troubles thee so deeply?" I set down my brush, my hands trembling slightly. "I am merely struggling with a crisis of faith," I said, which was not entirely untrue. "A crisis of faith?" Sister Margaret raised an eyebrow. "In what manner? How could I explain without revealing too much? I find myself questioning whether I am truly suited to this life, whether my devotion is pure enough, my commitment strong enough." Sister Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Ah, child, such doubts are not uncommon, particularly for one who entered the religious life as thou didst, fleeing from worldly troubles rather than drawn by divine calling." Her words stung because they held such truth. I had indeed fled to this priory, seeking refuge from the chaos and grief that had destroyed my family. My vocation had been born of desperation, not dedication, and perhaps that fundamental flaw had made me vulnerable to the temptations that now tormented me. "Dost thou think," I asked carefully, "that one who entered religious life for the wrong reasons can ever find true peace within these walls?" "I think," Sister Margaret replied thoughtfully, "that God works in mysterious ways, and that sometimes those who flee to him in their distress find that he was calling them all along. But I also think that if thy doubts are so severe, thou shouldst speak with Mother Abbess. She has great wisdom in such matters." The suggestion filled me with dread. But I knew Sister Margaret was right. My turmoil was becoming too obvious to ignore, and soon others would begin asking questions I could not answer. Perhaps it was time to seek counsel, even if I could not reveal the full truth of my situation. I shall consider it, I said, though the words felt like lead in my mouth. That evening, after Compline, I made my way to Mother Abbess's chamber. The corridors of the priory were dark at this hour, lit only by the occasional torch in its iron sconce. My footsteps echoed softly on the stone floors, and I found myself moving as quietly as possible, as if I were engaged in some clandestine mission, which, in a way, I supposed I was. Mother Scholastica received me in her private study, a small room lined with books and religious artifacts collected over her many years of service. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair and keen gray eyes that seemed to see everything. I had always found her intimidating, though she was unfailingly kind to all her charges. "Sister Catherine," she said, gesturing for me to take the chair across from her desk, "I confess I am not surprised by thy visit. Sister Margaret spoke to me of her concerns for thy welfare." I settled myself nervously, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I fear I have not been entirely myself of late, Mother." "So I have observed." Her gaze was penetrating but not unkind. "Thou hast served faithfully here for 3 years, child. In all that time, I have never seen thee so troubled. What weighs upon thy spirit?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything, the desire, the impossibility of my situation, but the words stuck in my throat, held back by shame and fear of the consequence. "I find myself questioning my calling," I said instead, wondering if perhaps I am not suited to this life after all. Mother Scholastica leaned back in her, studying me with those piercing eyes. "And what has brought about this crisis of faith? Some specific event, or merely the accumulation of doubts over time?" I struggled to find words that would explain without revealing. "I find myself plagued by thoughts that are unworthy of my station, desires that mock the vows I have taken." "Ah!" The abbess nodded slowly, and I saw understanding dawn in her expression. "Thou speakest of carnal desires." Heat flooded my cheek, but I forced myself to nod. "Yes, mother, child," she said gently. "Such struggles are more common than thou might believe. The flesh is weak, and even the most devout among us are sometimes tested by earthly longing. This does not make thee unworthy of thy calling, it makes the human. But surely, I protest, one who was truly called to this life would not be so susceptible to such temptation. On the contrary, Mother Scholastica, in my experience, those who claim never to have felt such desires are either lying or spiritually dead. The struggle against the flesh is part of our earthly trial. Sister Catherine, it is how we respond to these temptations that matters, not whether we feel them." Her words should have comforted me, but instead they only deepened my shame. For I had not merely felt temptation, I had acted upon. I had kissed a priest, had allowed myself to be kissed by him, had reveled in the warmth of his touch even as I knew it damned us both. What if, I asked carefully, one has not merely felt these desires but has acted upon them in some small way? The abbess's expression grew more serious. "What manner of action, child?" I could not meet her eyes. "A moment of weakness, a transgression that went against everything I have sworn to. With whom?" The question hung in the air between us like a sword suspended by a thread. I knew that if I answered truthfully, the consequences would be swift and severe. Father Benedict would be removed from his position in disgrace, sent away to face punishment from his superior, and I would likely face expulsion from the priory, my reputation destroyed, my future uncertain. But perhaps that would be for the best. Perhaps it was time to face the consequences of our action. "I cannot say," I whispered, taking the coward's path. To do so would destroy another as surely as myself. Mother Scholastica was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled before her as she considered my words. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "I see. And this transgression, was it repeated? Is it ongoing?" "No," I said quickly. "It was a single moment of weakness, nothing more. But the memory of it, the knowledge of what I am capable of, it haunts me. Mother, I fear I am not strong enough to resist such temptation should it arise again. And the other party to this transgression, how do they regard what passed between you?" I thought of Father Benedict's desperate attempts to avoid me, his careful distance, his obvious struggle with his own conscience. "I believe they regret it as deeply as I do." The abbess nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," she said, The transgression has served its purpose as a lesson. Sometimes God allows us to fall so that we might learn the true depth of our weakness and our need for His grace. Do you truly believe that? I asked desperately. That God might forgive such a sin? Child, Mother Scholastica said gently, there is no sin so great that it cannot be forgiven by a truly repentant heart. But forgiveness does not mean there are no consequences. Actions have results. Choices have prices. The question thou must ask thyself is not whether God can forgive thee, but whether thou canst forgive thyself and whether thou art strong enough to ensure such weakness does not occur again. I know not, I admitted. That is what terrifies me most. Then, perhaps, she said thoughtfully, it is time to consider whether thy calling truly lies within these walls, or whether God is using this trial to guide thee toward a different path. The suggestion struck me like a physical blow. You think I should leave? I think thou shouldst pray deeply and honestly about what God desires for thy life. If thy presence here creates occasions for sin for thyself or another, then remaining might not be the most virtuous choice. Her words followed me as I made my way back to my cell, echoing in my mind like a funeral bell. Was she right? Was my very presence at the Priory a source of temptation that endangered not only my own soul but that of another? I knelt beside my narrow bed, trying to pray, but my thoughts were in too much turmoil to focus on sacred words. Instead, I found myself remembering the kiss, the desperate tenderness in Father Benedict's eyes, the way his hands had trembled as he held my face. Had it truly been just a moment of weakness, as I had told the abbess, or had it been something deeper, more dangerous, a glimpse of a love that could destroy us both if we allowed it to grow? And if it was the latter, what choice did we have but to flee from each other, even if it meant abandoning the life we had both chosen? The answer came to me 3 nights later, in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep eluded me and prayer felt like mockery. I had been lying in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl around the priory walls, when I heard the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my cell. Normally, such a sound would not have disturbed me. The sisters occasionally moved about the building at night, attending to various needs or seeking solitude for private prayer. But something about these particular footsteps made me hold my breath and strain to listen more carefully. They stopped outside my door. For long moments, neither the mysterious visitor nor I moved. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, wondering who might be standing just beyond the thin wooden barrier that separated us. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, came the softest of knocks. I rose from my bed, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, and approached the door with trembling hands. Who is there? I whispered. Benedict. The single word sent shockwaves through my entire being. What was he doing here? What could possibly have driven him to such a desperate act as seeking me out in the privacy of my cell? With shaking fingers, I lifted the wooden latch and opened the door just wide enough to see him standing in the shadowy corridor. He had forgone his usual robes for a simple tunic and cloak, as if he had thrown on whatever was closest at hand. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wild with some emotion I could not name. What are you doing here? I breathed, acutely aware that discovery would mean ruin for us both. I cannot sleep, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper. I cannot eat, cannot pray, cannot think of anything save ... He stopped, running his hands through his dark hair. God help me, Catherine, but I cannot stop thinking of you. The use of my given name, spoken with such raw desperation, nearly brought me to my knees. I glanced quickly down the corridor, ensuring we were still alone, then stepped back to allow him entry. He hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold into my cell. The space was so small that his presence seemed to fill it entirely. We stood facing each other in the pale light that filtered through my single narrow window, 2 souls balanced on the precipice of damnation. You must go, I whispered, even as every fiber of my being rebelled against the words. If we are discovered, ... I know, he said, yet he made no move to. I know what this risks, I know what we are. But I had to see you, had to tell you, ... He swallowed hard. The bishop has agreed to my request for reassignment. I leave for the monastery at Whitby within the fortnight. The words struck me like a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs. I had known this moment might come, had even told myself it would be for the best. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real, in a way that shattered something deep within my chest. "So soon," I managed to say. "It is best," he replied, though his voice held no conviction. "Every day I remain here is another test of resolve. I fear I shall fail. Already I find excuse to walk past the scriptorium, hoping for a glimpse of. I linger after Mass, watching you kneel in prayer. This madness must end before we damn ourselves utterly." I closed my eyes, feeling tears spill down my cheeks. And what of me? Am I to remain here, carrying this burden alone? How am I to continue serving God when my heart feels as though it has been torn from my chest? "You are stronger than I," he said softly. "You will find peace in time." Will I? I opened my eyes to look at him. This man, who had become my salvation and my damnation in equal measure. Or will I spend the rest of my days wondering what might have been if we had possessed the courage to choose love over duty? He flinched, as if I had struck him. "Do not speak of love, Catherine. What lies between us is temptation, nothing more. To call it love would be to make it sacred, and there is nothing sacred in the violation of our vows." His words cut deep, but I saw the lie in his eyes, heard the tremor in his voice that betrayed his. "Is it not love that keeps you awake at night?" I challenged. "Is it not love that brought you to my door in the darkness? Is it not love that torments you as it torments me?" "Catherine, ... double quotes," he began, but I stepped closer, close enough that I could see the pulse beating rapidly at his throat. "Tell me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "tell me that what you feel is mere lust, mere weakness of the flesh. Tell me that I mean no more to you than any other temptation you have faced." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, his chest rising and falling with his labored breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken. "I cannot," he admitted. "God forgive me, but I cannot lie about this, not to you. What I feel, ... it is deeper than mere desire. It is a longing of the soul, a recognition of something I never knew I lacked until I found it in your eyes." The confession hung between us like a bridge we could either cross or burn. I reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard against my palm. "Then why must we flee from it?" I asked. "Why must we choose duty over the very thing that makes us feel most alive?" "Because," he said, catching my hand and pressing it firmly against his, "our duty is not merely to ourselves, but to God, to the Church, to all those who look to us for guidance. What message do we send if we abandon our vows the moment they become inconvenient? And what message do we send if we choose a sterile existence over the very love that God Himself placed within our hearts?" The question seemed to pain him beyond measure. He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch as if drawing strength from it. "Do you think," he said quietly, "that I have not asked myself the same question 1,000 times? Do you think I have not wondered if perhaps God means for us to be together, if our meeting was not chance but providence? And what answer did you that I am a weak man, seeking to justify his weakness with pretty philosophy?" He opened his eyes, and I saw such torment there that I felt my heart break for him. "The path is clear, Catherine. Our vows are sacred, our duties plain. What we feel, it must be sacrificed upon the altar of our calling, must it?" I stepped closer still, until we were nearly touching. Or might there be another way? Before he could ask what I meant, I reached behind my neck and began to unfasten the simple wooden cross that had marked me as a bride of Christ for 3 long years. His eyes widened in shock as he realized my intent. "Catherine, no, you cannot mean ... double quotes. "I can," I said firmly, lifting the cross over my head and setting it aside. "I have been thinking much since our last conversation, praying for guidance, seeking God's will in this matter, and I believe He has given me an answer." "What answer?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to propose would change everything between us, one way or another. "Come away with me," I said. "Leave this place, leave these vows that we took in ignorance of what love truly meant. We could travel to the continent, to lands where no one knows us. You could serve as a simple priest in some village parish, and I I could be your wife in all but the eyes of the church. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear both our hearts beating in the stillness. Father Benedict stared at me as if I had suggested we sprout wings and fly to the moon. You speak of apostasy, he said finally, of abandoning everything we have sworn to uphold. I speak of choosing love over law, humanity over instinct. Is that not what Christ himself did when he walked among? Christ was without sin? He shook his head. What you propose would damn us both, would it? I challenged. Or would it free us to serve God in a different way? To love him through loving each other. The Church teaches that marriage is a sacrament, a reflection of God's love for humanity. How can such love be damned? I could see the battle raging behind his eyes, desire warring with duty, love fighting against a lifetime of conditioning. For a moment, I thought I had offered a vision of life that might overcome his scruples. Then he stepped back, his face hardening with resolve. No, he said firmly, I will not be the cause of your spiritual destruction, nor will I destroy myself for the sake of earthly pleasure. Our vows were made before God. Catherine, they cannot be unmade by human desire. The rejection cut deeper than any blade could have. I felt something vital within me wither and die, leaving only emptiness behind. Then go, I said, my voice hollow. Leave for Whitby. Forget this conversation ever occurred. Live your holy life. Serve your righteous God, and pray that you never wonder what might have been. Catherine, double quotes go. The word came out as a sob. Please, just go. He stood there for another moment, his face a mask of anguish, before turning and walking to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, not looking back. I shall pray for your soul, he said quietly, and I shall carry the memory of what might have been to my grave. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the ruins of my dreams and the bitter taste of regret. I remained standing in the center of my cell until the bells rang for lauds, watching the pale light of dawn creep across the floor where he had stood. When I finally moved, it was to pick up the wooden cross I had cast aside and hold it in my trembling hand. The weight of it seemed different now, heavier somehow, as if it carried not only the burden of my vows, but the full measure of my sacrifice. I placed it around my neck once more, feeling the familiar press of it against my throat. Outside my window, I could hear the other sisters beginning to stir, preparing for another day of prayer and service. Soon, I would need to join them, to take my place in the chapel, and pretend that my world had not crumbled during the dark hours before dawn. But first, I allowed myself this moment of grief for the love I had found too late, the life I would never live, the man I would never hold in my arms as his wife. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of numbness. I attended prayers, performed my duties, spoke when spoken to, but I felt as though I were watching my life from a great distance, as if I had become a ghost haunting my own existence. Father Benedict kept to his word, maintaining complete distance between us in his final days at the priory. During his last mass, I watched him from my place among the sisters, memorizing the lines of his face, the sound of his voice, the way his hands moved as he blessed the communion bread. When he spoke the final blessing, his eyes found mine across the chapel for just a moment, and I saw in them an echo of my own desperate sorrow. Then he was gone, departed before dawn with no ceremony, no farewells, save the formal blessing he had given the community the night before. I discovered his absence when I went to the chapel for private prayer and found a strange priest preparing for morning mass. Where is Father Benedict? I asked Sister Margaret, though I already knew the answer. He departed early this morning for his new assignment, she replied. Poor man looked quite worn down by his duties. Perhaps the change will do him good. I nodded and took my place for prayers, though the words felt like stones in my mouth. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my work with desperate intensity, copying manuscripts until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned, tending the herb garden until my back ached, praying until my knees bled from the cold stone floor. If I could exhaust my body completely, perhaps I could silence the voice in my heart that whispered of loss and longing. But even the most fervent activity could not fill the emptiness he had left behind. At night, alone in my cell, I would remember the warmth of the gentle touch of his hand, the desperate love in his eyes when he had come to me in the darkness. I would wonder where he was, whether he thought of me, whether he had found the peace that continued to elude me. Mother Scholastica watched my transformation with knowing eyes, but said nothing, perhaps understanding that some griefs could only be healed by time and grace. The other sisters began to treat me with a kind of gentle deference, as if they recognized that I carried some invisible wound. It was Sister Agatha, the eldest among us, who finally spoke to me directly about my condition. I found her in the chapel one evening, kneeling before the altar with the patience of one who had spent her life in communion with the divine. "Child," she said, as I settled beside her, "thou carriest a burden that grows heavier each day. Perhaps it is time to set it down." "I know not how, sister," I replied honestly. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft with age and wisdom, "the greatest sacrifice we can make is not of our desires, but of our regrets. To cling to what might have been is to refuse the grace of what is." Her words stayed with me as the seasons turned and a year passed since Father Benedict's departure. Slowly, gradually, I began to understand what she meant. I could not change the choices we had made, could not undo the love that had bloomed and withered between, but I could choose how to carry that experience forward, instead of seeing our brief connection as a source of shame. I began to view it as a gift, a reminder that even in the cloistered world of religious life, the human heart remained capable of profound love. That love had not been consummated, had not led to the abandonment of our vows, but it had been real and transformative nonetheless. I began to find meaning in my daily prayers again, not as empty recitations, but as genuine conversations with the God who had created love itself. I poured the intensity of my feelings into my illuminated manuscript, creating works of such beauty that they drew praise from bishops and scholars. I counseled younger sisters who struggled with doubts and offering them the wisdom I had gained through my own trial. 2 years after Father Benedict's departure, I received word that touched my heart in ways I had not expected. A traveling merchant brought news from the monastery at Whitby. Father Benedict had become renowned for his compassionate care of the poor and sick, his powerful sermons drawing crowds from villages far and wide. He had established a school for orphaned children, and was said to be writing a treatise on the nature of divine love. The news filled me with a bittersweet joy. He had found his calling, had transformed the anguish of our separation into service to others. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that our love, brief and impossible though it had not been meaningless. It had changed us both, had deepened our capacity for compassion and understanding. Perhaps that had been God's plan all along. 5 years have passed now since that morning when I knelt in the chapel and spoke my forbidden desire. I am no longer the young woman who fled to these walls in grief and desperation. The trials of love and loss have tempered me like steel in a forge, creating something stronger and more purposeful than what came. I still think of Father Benedict, how could I not? But the sharp pain of separation has mellowed into something gentler. A warm remembrance of a love that was true even if it could not be fulfilled. I pray for him nightly, asking God to bless his work and grant him. And sometimes, in my dreams, I imagine that in whatever realm awaits us after this earthly trial, souls may love freely without the constraints of human law and custom. Perhaps there we shall meet again, not as priest and nun bound by impossible vows, but simply as two spirits who recognized in each other a reflection of the divine. Until that day, I serve God here as faithfully as I know how, carrying within my heart the memory of a love that taught me more about the nature of sacrifice than any sermon or scripture ever could. For in the end, is not love itself a form of prayer, a recognition of the sacred that exists in the connection between souls? The bells of St. Agatha's Priory still ring with their familiar weight, marking the passage of days but now when I hear them, I am reminded not only of duty and devotion, but of the brief, shining moment when my heart knew perfect love and the grace I found in choosing to let it go. I close this account as the final light of evening fades beyond my window, hoping that those who hear this tale may understand that even the most impossible love can serve God's purpose. For it is in loving and in sacrificing that love, when duty calls, that we learn the true depth of what it means to be human. And perhaps, in the mystery of divine providence, that understanding is the greatest gift we can offer to the one who created love itself. If this chronicle hath touched thy heart, I beseech thee to mark thy appreciation upon this, and mayhap thou wilt share thy thoughts in discourse with others who have heard this tale. Should thy soul hunger for more such narratives of love and sacrifice, seek thou the next story by selecting the image that doth appear at thy left hand.